Kia ora koutou katoa, and a warm welcome to Te Papa and to tonight's panel. The title, The Gap Between Rich and Poor, and Why It Matters. In this time of rapidly widening inequality across the developed world, New Zealand has experienced one of the biggest increases in the gap between rich and poor of any developed country. This widening gap has become a source of concern to many New Zealanders, and rightly so, given the evidence of the way it divides communities and harms us. Tonight we're going to hear three speakers, Stephanie McIntyre, Philippa Howden-Chapman and Colin James, and they're each going to discuss different aspects of this threat that widening inequality poses to New Zealand personally, socially and economically. And then we'll throw the floor open to questions from you people. It would be good if you could turn off cell phones now, because we are indeed recording. This forum actually, and a second one on the 4th of October, stems from a publication that journalist Max Rashbrook has on the go, which will come out next year. Max is here with us tonight, and I'll hand over to him now to introduce the topic.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te kaupapa o te hui e tēnei po, kia mōhio mai ai koe. Te nui o te tāke, ara ko te rerekētanga, inequality. Nau mai, haere. Well, thanks everyone for coming to the first of these talks, which really stems from the moment when I came back to New Zealand a couple of years ago after a long spell in the UK. And I was very much struck by how much gaps seem to be opening up in New Zealand between the rich and the rest, and the way that that was leading to an increasingly divided country in a way that we hadn't been before. And at the same time, I felt we weren't really having a debate about that we needed to. So as Claudia says, I've been working with my publisher, Bridget Williams, on a book on inequality, which will be out early next year, and which all the speakers here tonight are contributing to one way or another. So this talk really is the start of that debate that I think we need to have, and I'll hand over reasonably shortly to the first of the speakers. But before that, I wanted to say a few words about what inequality means and why I care about it and why we're here. And when we talk about inequality, we're mostly talking about income inequality, which is very simply that gap between the rich and poor, the difference in income that goes to the top, the middle and the bottom. There's also a related idea around equality of opportunity, which is more to do with how free people are to move up and down within those different income brackets. And you look here, people saying that that's the thing that really matters, equality of opportunity. But the approach that we're taking in the book, and what I believe personally, is that although it is important to improve opportunities, just focusing on that by itself isn't enough. Firstly, because it doesn't do anything to help people who do end up at the bottom, and because there's a lot of evidence, I think, about the gaps, the damage that's caused by those big income gaps, and also I think some really basic ethical and fairness issues about widening inequality. I'd also say, though, that the two ideas are pretty fundamentally linked. People can't really take advantage of opportunities that are theoretically available to them if they don't have enough income to get by day to day. And obviously children from worse off families are at a massive disadvantage when it comes to trying to take advantage of the opportunities that are around here. So I think it's not surprising that the countries with the smallest income gaps are also the ones that have the greatest social mobility and do the best at making opportunities available to everyone. So my view is that we need to concentrate on both types of inequality and focus on enhancing both opportunities and equality of income. So having said all that, where are we in New Zealand when it comes to inequality? Well, you may have seen the reports a few weeks ago that the gaps between the rich and the rest are at the highest level since we started tracking them closely in the early 80s. And I say the rich and the rest particularly because for me what's happened in the last 30 years is that incomes for people at the bottom and in the middle of New Zealand have stagnated or even gone backwards. And it's only at the top that incomes have really increased dramatically. If you look at the poorest 10%, in the mid-1980s, they had an after-tax income of about $11,500. Today, that figure's $13,000, which is really only about a 15% increase. And if you take into account housing costs, which have increased a lot faster than income, those people in the bottom 10% actually have less disposable income now than they did 25 years ago, which I think is pretty shocking. In the middle, though it's not much better, they've had a roughly 20% increase in after-tax income. And so it's really only at the top, amongst the top 10%, where incomes after tax have gone from about $56,000 to around $90,000 today, which is a 60% increase. And within that top 10%, the top 1% are now earning 5 times more than they did in the mid-1980s, with an average income of about $330,000 each. So when you hear those figures, it's really not surprising that we have the biggest increase in the gap between the rich and the rest of any country in the developed world, which I think is pretty remarkable for a country that was once among the most egalitarian countries and prided itself on that. The question then is, how did we get to where we are today? And if you look at the period when the gap really opened up from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, you find that it was caused partly by New Zealand just opening up its economy to the rest of the world, which meant, some traditionally reasonably well-paid jobs in manufacturing and the like going overseas, and also much more opportunities for companies to make significant profits at the top end. But that growing gap also came about because of some really specific domestic policies that we introduced, things like cutting the top tax rate from 66 to 33%, cutting benefits, and a big reduction in the number of people who are in trade unions. If you fast forward a little bit, the early 2000s, the gap between the rich and rest did actually stabilise a bit and even dropped, mostly thanks to working for families. But since then, in the last year especially, we've seen those gaps open up again as the investment income, shares and the like for people in the top third in New Zealand have recovered following the global financial crisis, while everybody else's incomes have fallen. So that's the backdrop for the talks you're going to hear tonight. A record and unfortunately a growing gap between the rich and the rest. I really do think this is one of the most urgent issues that we face as a country, and I hope you'll find what you hear tonight both interesting and stimulating, and I hope that you'll stay with us as we continue this debate in the weeks and months to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Max, and I'd like to introduce the first speaker, that's Stephanie McIntyre. She's Executive Director of the Downtown Community Ministry of Wellington, and she's going to share with us real life stories of how inequality affects people's lives. Stephanie.
Kia ora tātou. It's good to be here tonight to consider this critical issue that we're facing, the growth of inequality in our society. As the Occupy movement that was camped out in Wellington's Civic Square dragged on into the new year, it provided a really graphic example of how unequal New Zealand society has become. The idealist initiators of the Occupy movement had already pulled up their tent pegs and gone home. They'd perhaps made their statement. Maybe if they're anything like me, they preferred Christmas at home in their own beds. But when they departed, they left a group of people behind them. And they were people who don't have many of the basic things that you and I take for granted. Things like an income, a bank account, a driver's licence, any sort of ID. They left behind people who had no homes to go to, and people who experienced multiple barriers to accessing a home. Some of those people couldn't just go out and get a flat because they had no income. Some couldn't go out and get an income because they didn't have any ID. And some couldn't get ID, maybe a birth certificate, because they didn't have a spare $26.50. And some may have asked work and income for an advance to cover the cost of a birth certificate, but because they'd had an advance for a birth certificate once before, they were declined assistance. So I hope you're starting to get a picture of how hard and how complex things can be right on the bottom of that inequality ladder. Down at DCM, we see people in these sorts of dire straits every single day. And for more than 40 years, DCM has literally been located in the heart of the city. And when people have got no money, no food, no roof over their heads, they come to us and we start with some of those really basic things by supporting them to get back on their feet. And I'm really pleased to say that we have plenty of success stories. I can tell you the classic stories of the person living under the bridge, one man who'd been under numerous bridges for 16 years, and I'm really pleased to say that we had the privilege of assisting him into his own little flat. So the news from the front line is certainly not all hopeless. We don't see very many families at DCM these days because low-income families actually got chased out of the city years ago by high rental costs. So the people who come to us now at DCM tend to be more typically single adults. They're single people, some of them are very adrift in the world, in the city, very increasingly dislocated from their community. Sometimes we call them the forgotten people. So my stories and reflections come from stories about these single people, and they may not necessarily be typical, but they are a new group of poor people in New Zealand, and I talk about them because that's who I know and who I interact with on a daily basis. And I want to tell you a little bit about a person who I'm going to refer to as Tony. So when Tony was growing up, he thought that his life was the norm. Both his parents experienced abuse as children. Although his father sometimes held down a job as a carpenter, he spent most of his adult life either hospitalised under the Mental Health Act or in jail. Tony's mother was an alcoholic. His first experience of getting drunk was with his mother, aged 12, in his school uniform at the local pub. And his first encounter with drugs was a packet of Disprins shaken up in a bottle of Coke. He was 10. As the eldest boy, Tony grew up with a strong belief that it was his responsibility to care for his 6 siblings. So when Dad was in hospital or jail and Mum was on a bender and money was short, Tony stole to put food on the table for the littlies. At 14, Tony was in Borstal. So throughout the 80s, as New Zealand embraced Rogernomics, and the 90s with euthanasia in full swing, and New Zealand kicked off on our meteoric rise to the top of the inequality table, Tony was bouncing in and out of jail. And prison was a tough environment, as he describes it. He talks about the guards as hard and ruthless, and then there was the pecking order of the inmates. He says he quickly became institutionalised in prison, and through the contacts he made in jail, he also became a patched gang member. But in between those stints in prison, he lived with his sisters so he could get his nieces and nephews off to school, make their lunches, breaking the cycles, how he describes it. And now I'm pleased to say that he's stable in a flat and he's had his longest stint on the outside ever. So Tony would be the first to claim that he's made some poor personal choices in his life. But when I reflect on his story, I can't help thinking that being poor results most frequently from an accident of which family you happen to have been born into, and that also pretty much determines where you are on the inequality continuum. So reflecting on that, I'm really worried about our society's collective view of those who occupy the far end, the poor end of the continuum. And I fear that one of the worst effects of our rapid rise in inequality is that in a very short space of time, those at the top of the league table, who incidentally happen to include our politicians and policymakers, seem to have really lost touch with that there but for the grace of God go I factor, whomever you define God to be. Because how else can we account for the regrettable trivialising of poor families that we've heard recently? Witness the comments made by Social Development Minister Paula Bennett, who recently claimed that children move in and out of poverty on a daily or weekly basis. And I quote her, "1 week they can be in poverty, then their parent can get a job or increase their income and they are no longer in poverty. This is the real world. And actually children move in and out of poverty at times on a weekly basis." Far from a grasp on the real world, inequality seems to be steering us further and further away from the realities of life for those who are poor. In my 8 years of working at DCM, I think I've started to grasp a reasonable idea of what the real world is like for poor people living at the sharp end of the inequality continuum. And it's taught me that being poor is really hard work, and that exiting poverty and moving up that social ladder is highly complex and, in fact, sadly, is a highly unlikely occurrence. Just consider for a minute the repeated exhortations for people to go out and get a job. People tell us day in and day out they'd love to have paid work, but the jobs simply aren't there for them. And when the job queue forms for scarce jobs, if like Tony, you've done a lot of time in prison, you can expect to automatically move to the back of the line. And on top of this, there's the stigma of them being blamed for your circumstances. People who come into DCM sometimes talk about their shame and humiliation. Many of them have actually taken this on board and think that their failure is their own fault. It's pretty hard in the face of constant criticism. They're either failing to avail themselves of the opportunities that are waiting out there for them, or if they only budgeted better, or if they pulled their socks up, or if they exercised more self-discipline. These things are really wear people down. We had a really sad example in our waiting room just the other day. There was a stinky old rubbish bin down the lane, and it was ponging the place to high heavens, and so I shut our front door, which we usually leave open. I shut it to stop this awful smell coming into our waiting room, and I apologised to people. "Oh, I'm really sorry, folks, that we're having to put up with this." And actually 2 or 3 people then, who was sleeping rough, quietly said to me, "Oh, but I thought that was me." You know, these are people who are really described as unaware of these circumstances often, but we find that people are often really concerned about the impact that they're having on other people. We seem to be rapidly moving away from a concern for the people who are experiencing disparity to a concern that they are simply a cost burden that as a nation we can't afford. And I want to illustrate with another brief story of how illogical things become, how counterintuitive they become when the actual person gets left out of the equation. So this is another true story about the grind a person found themselves in, who bought a car when they were in paid work, but who's now reliant on a benefit. So now that person gets the princely sum of $204.96 a week, so we'll round that up to $205. But out of their benefit come a whole lot of weekly deductions. Now they're legitimate deductions. Various statutory agencies have got the right to take these out of this person's benefit without any negotiation with the beneficiary. So it starts with housing, and I guess depending on how you look at things, this person's pretty lucky to be in a Housing New Zealand flat. So that's the first deduction of $50 a week. Then there's the power to Genesis, $28 a week. And here's another little impact of inequality. So unlike me, who can jump on Power Shop's website and buy cheaper power, those deals don't tend to get offered to people who pay a set weekly rate for power, so they're paying more for power than I do. Then there's the $16.60 a week in child support, followed by the $10 a week in fines, the $9 to pay back work and income for advances, and then there's the $20 in tenant liability because the benefit fell over at one point and rent was unpaid for a while. And then there's the $1.50 a week to the doctor so that cost doesn't stop this person accessing the doctor. And then to cap it off, there's $30 for the car. Well, that's the car that got repossessed after the person lost their job and defaulted on their loan and now has penalties and fees attached. I'm not debating whether these are legitimate payments, but if you're good at maths, which I'm not, but you've been doing the sums, you'll find that what the person's left with is $40 a week. So the $205 got whittled away by those outgoings down to $165.10 per week. So think about it. That's $40 to cover the food, maybe a phone, any transport costs, clothing. Forget the dentist. Forget visiting your kids who live in another city. Forget fun. And for many people, that's a situation that is just impossible to climb out of. So facing up to the impacts of New Zealand's inequality carries a moral and ethical imperative. We need to be willing to look at the complexities that live behind the surface, the complexities of people's lives, to consider and acknowledge the complexity of poverty and inequality. Facing up to the impacts of New Zealand's inequality is also carries a humanitarian imperative. These are real people who experience humiliation, who have feelings. They're not a homogeneous mass. They're individuals who deserve our compassion. And facing up to the impacts of New Zealand's inequality carries an economic imperative. There's a debate going on right now about what it costs for someone to live on a benefit for life. Actually, I thought it was relatively little compared to, say, the cost of a policy analyst's salary for a year. And it's certainly very little compared to the cost of a year spent in prison. But it's doing nothing that makes the least economic sense. So in closing, I want to put in a plug for the forgotten people who struggle daily with little control over their lives, who experience the stigma of being looked down on and the deep and grinding stress of wondering how on earth they'll pay the bills and get through the days ahead, and yet who frequently, we find, express so much gratitude and appreciation for assistance and support. So from me, it's kia kaha to them. So let's hear it for the forgotten people. Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you. I'd like to introduce now Philippa Howden-Chapman. She's a pioneering health researcher, director of the He Kainga Oranga Housing and Health Research Program. And Philippa teaches in the area of health and public policy at the University of Otago's Wellington School, and she chairs a World Health Organization group on housing. She's going to talk about the evidence linking inequality with poor health, bad housing, and other social problems. Philippa.
Thank you. Ngā mihi ki te kopapa o te tēnei rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a great pleasure to be here in Te Papa Tongarewa, and some of you like me, might have seen that wonderful exhibition Kahu Ora on the cloaks here. And when I was thinking last week when we saw it about how to frame this talk today, it struck me that the essence of social cohesion is weaving people together. And I was talking with a friend and colleague of mine about ranga, the idea of weaving, and the idea that when the kuia calls people onto the marae, that karanga is the process of weaving together the visitors with the people who are there by right, and that the rangatira is drawing people, weaving them together towards a particular path. And I thought that was a very, as in many things, learning both from Te Reo and from Māori, a very powerful image of what we need to do. We need the political will to actually address inequalities, and we need to work together, be drawn together to actually address it. So until the 1980s, we only measured gross domestic product in New Zealand, how much the economy was growing, as it usually did in that period. We didn't even look at the Gini coefficient, which is the usual measure of inequalities in the country. And we thought we were a very egalitarian country, which we were up until that stage, and we had much the same inequality that they had in other social democratic countries like in Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And we assumed that that was the case. And in fact, Treasury didn't measure inequalities. It was the Rowntree Foundation in Britain that told us that we had in the mid-1980s, in the late 1980s, 1990s, that we had the fastest rising inequality in the whole of the OECD. We weren't the top, that goes to countries like Chile and Brazil, but we went from 0.25 up to 0.33. We're now about 0.34. America, United States is at 0.38. So I think that's really interesting that it's not something that we even bothered to measure. We just assumed that we were doing okay. Now, if we were in the European Union, there's constant monitoring of how they stand on inequalities. And I was privileged to be part of an EU network group on monitoring that. And they take it very, very seriously, monitoring each year, going up and down. And New Zealand, in fact, doesn't pay a very small amount of money to be part of the Luxembourg income study, which would mean that those figures came out very regularly. And those of you who are interested in the area know that we often don't appear on various tables because we don't provide the kind of information that's needed. So why is this important? What theory underlies the fact that we should be monitoring income inequalities? Well, Sir Michael Marmot, who led the WHO Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, talks about the causes of the causes. And I think that's a grand phrase because richer people, people with more income, more education, more housing, tend on average to be healthier and happier than poorer people in society. Now, this is true whether the country is a very rich country or a very poor country. Life expectancy is unrelated to differences in average income in rich countries. So this is really interesting. And Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett wrote this book, The Spirit Level, Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better. And they showed that the size of income differences between those earning the most and those earning the least was the most important in a whole range of factors. And most particularly because in the period since income inequalities have grown since the mid-1980s in New Zealand, as the power of government or of governments have declined to intervene in the economy so much, in fact, that place has been taken by corporations. And my husband, who's here in the audience, when we talk about what part of the newspaper we'll read, I always go to the business pages first because I think that this is the driver of inequalities. And just as I was preparing this speech last week, I saw this article about Paul Reynolds and telecom, which some of you might have seen. And it was saying that basically his final year payments, this final year, was 13 million. And that excluded the cost of his accommodation and his phone, which was going to be paid up to the end of this month. Now, the average income in New Zealand is about 38,000. So I did a quick calculation. Mr. Reynolds earns 342 times the average income. And in countries like Japan, which have a very long life expectancy and very low income inequality, the CEO usually earns 4 times as much as the person working on the shop floor. So that is pretty extraordinary. And when you combine that with the fact that we looked at wealth, it's even more marked in New Zealand, and we have no capital gains tax. It's not surprising that Richard Wilkinson, who's visited in New Zealand and is very interested in New Zealand, by the way, he comes from a Quaker background, so I think there's very strong values that underpin all this work of his. When you look at all the graphs in that book, New Zealand has lower levels of trust. On that, we've still got a residual of goodwill and small society, the fact that most of us know each other or can recognise each other in some way. Lower levels of voting, as income inequality goes up, people vote less. Higher infant mortality, higher levels of depression and anxiety, lower life expectancy, poorer educational outcomes, higher rates of teenage births, higher levels of sole parenting, and higher imprisonment rates. That's quite a list. And they're all associated with the level of income inequality in the country. And as income inequality has risen in New Zealand, all of those things have become more pronounced. The steeper the social gradient within society, the more strongly it is related to inequality. That's quite, when I teach in my public policy course, it seems like, what is this phenomenon that causes this whole range of outcomes? And I think the mechanism has become reasonably clear. Amartya Sen, who I'm a great fan of, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has written recently a great book called The Right to Justice. And in it he talks about what he thinks is a just society is one where people live the life that they have reason to value. Not that they should earn high incomes, not that they should be able to do this or that, but the right to live a life that they value. And I think that's a very important value that we need to carry forward. In a society where people can live the life that they value, I think there is a very strong sense of citizenship, of creating a better society, a sense of entitlement that you contribute to the society and that you share the risks of other people's society and they will support you. There are universal benefits. There are much less targeting, much less punitive way of getting people to do things. And there's a strong sense of social investment. We will support and take care of you, and you will support and take care of us. So is the situation that we're in New Zealand reversible with these growing rates of inequality? Well, many of us try and keep our weight stable and know that it's much easier to put on weight than to actually take it off. So political will and determination, I think, is really critical. Now, inequalities increased very rapidly in the 1990s because it was it was considered irrelevant, not of political interest. And the Ministry of Social Development, there are two heroes in there, Brian Perry, who produces these reports, basically by himself now, and John Jensen used to work with him, which, thank God for Brian Perry. And he documented now, his Treasury doesn't do it, this increase in inequalities in the 1990s. Now it did stabilise in the 2000s, and I think that was because the Labour government with its partners understood the determinants of health, the pernicious, corrosive effects of inequalities, and increased the minimum wage, reintroduced income-related rents, and most particularly working for families, which was the largest redistribution of income in the last 30 years. But as we've seen in the paper, then it didn't get much attention. I'm delighted how many people are here tonight, by the way. There was an increase again basically in 2009, 2010, and from what we've seen a bit from 2011. So it stabilised, went down, and now we're on the road up again. So inequalities are driven largely, I think, in New Zealand by the employment status, when you don't buffer people who are unemployed, and housing costs. And again, that's another talk. The lack of social housing in New Zealand, the lack of affordable housing, In some countries like France and Denmark, where there's a much stronger role of the unions, and in Denmark where there's a much stronger cultural value about inequality, largely I think because of the effect of being invaded during the war and that sense of solidarity, inequalities have not gone up, and it's a point of pride in those countries that they haven't. So just in conclusion, I'd like to talk about some solutions. Now I know Max has organised this very carefully and solutions next week, but I couldn't bear not to think about some solutions. I've had the privilege of being on the expert working group on child poverty, and my research group that I work with put all our work through a child health lens, a child well-being lens. And it's very salutary to remember, and this goes back to the point about social investment, that actually the greatest wealth in our country is not the fact that maybe they'll strike, a new Maui gas field off the Taranaki coast, or heaven forbid that we should start, mining coal again down in the South Island or Fonterra, but the fact that we have the most youthful population in the OECD. That's our greatest wealth, and we need to recognise it. But 1 in 6 European children are growing up in poverty, as measured by 60% below the median income, and 1 in 3 Maori children. And these are the children who we should be investing in. The working group, which include Business New Zealand representatives, entrepreneurs, academics, a whole range of people, points out very strongly we should be measuring inequalities, particularly the impact on children, and we should have a universal child allowance. It's great that superannuitants, that I'm closer to that end than the other end, have an allowance that enables them to live on. But why don't we provide that for children, so that children don't have to, parents have to decide whether to heat their house or have food for the children to eat. It's really, really important that we get this universal benefit for children under 6 to begin with, as well as older people, that there should be horizontal equity. We think in terms of housing that it should be part of the National Infrastructure Plan. It does actually appear, housing, in the Treasury's National Infrastructure Plan, but it's in the appendix. And we think it's actually as important, if not more important, than roads. But both are important. Both we need to invest and maintain them. And particularly, we need to regulate the private rental market, where 70% of children in poverty live, 50% of in the private rental market. Why should landlords be able to rent out houses that make children sick? So in conclusion, I think of all of us here tonight are here under Max's cloak and Richard's cloak to create a better society, and reducing inequality would increase the well-being and quality of life for us all. Improving the health of all children would improve the health and well-being of all of us, whether we're just been born, whether we're adults or we're older people. Karanga mai, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Philippa. Our next speaker is Colin James. Colin is a well-known political journalist and has been, I think, for more than 30 years, and a regular commentator on radio and television. Colin's going to suggest how we might think differently about inequalities and the place of those in our society.
Kia ora tātou. Inequality is good and necessary. Without inequality, there can be no society we would want to call human. To be human is to be unique and conscious of that uniqueness. It is our individual inequalities that make each of us unique, and without which we could not be free in the deep sense of that word. A human society or nation is an association of unique individuals with common purpose. The inequalities which make us unique and free might be called positive inequalities. They enrich human society through diversity, innovation, imagination, expression, and enterprise. A society or nation aiming to enhance its well-being nurtures and protects those positive inequalities. But not all inequalities are positive. Some reduce our freedoms and or set up tensions which undermine a society's or nation's cohesion and therefore capacity for common purpose. If a society or nation is to do well over time, it needs to ameliorate, reduce, or eliminate those negative inequalities. That is a choice we can make, to nurture our positive inequalities and minimize our negative inequalities. This is an ethical, social, and economic question. It goes beyond a simple focus on inequality of income and wealth, and even beyond the feedback loops between that inequality and consequent and contributing inequalities of health and capacity to make a living. Some of our inequalities we inherit. That influences how intelligent, resilient, physically and artistically capable, we are, and confers abilities, some exceptional, disabilities, some severe, health or ill health. We have different neural wiring, which affects how we deal with others and with adversity and opportunity. Some of our inequalities we owe to our parents and our caregivers or not caregivers. Parents and caregivers influence our epigenetic experiences in very early life, which determine how some of our genes operate. Our parents and caregivers locate us in nationality, in heritage and culture, and in neighbourhood, all of which influence our early perceptions of the world, and some of which stay with us. How our parents and caregivers nurture or don't nurture our bodies and minds sets limits to our capacity for schooling, and so for work, our state of health, and our aspirations or lack of aspiration and capacity to realise those aspirations. Some of our inequalities are the result of accident or luck, good or bad. These can open or close doors to opportunity. Some equalities are imposed by the society around us or by the nation operating through the state, by way of customs, laws and administrative rules, markets and politics. Who has power and how it is exercised and constrained is important in building or reducing our inequalities. Those many different inequalities determine to a large extent our different capacities to take a full part in society and in the societies around us, and our different capacities for a satisfying, enjoyable, rewarding life, and to fully participate in a subset of society, the economy, and its distribution of material goods, which determines our income and wealth. And in turn, income and wealth can intensify or ameliorate many of the inequalities. Low income and wealth, at the extreme usually called poverty, limit the quality of housing, nutrition, healthcare and education opportunities, even of people who are determined, well-organised and capable. They increase the likelihood of disability and disadvantage, which in turn reduce capacity to earn income and accumulate wealth. Conversely, high income and wealth increase educational opportunity and enhance health status and thus expand earning capacity. The educational meritocracy, who gained an economic advantage from the wider access to higher education in the 1960s, have bequeathed that gain to their children and then grandchildren, who have been much more likely to go on to higher education and so a higher earning capacity than the descendants of those who did not go on to higher education. The meritocracy has become a privileged group or class, and conversely, economic and social disadvantage has become intergenerationally embedded in some neighbourhoods. Or economic and social mobility, which enhances the contribution individuals can make to national, social and economic well-being, may have slowed. What should be done about the inequalities, if anything? Why not just leave them be? Well, there are several arguments for the nation, through its state apparatus, to take action. One argument is ethical. An ethical case can readily be made for helping individuals offset or eliminate negative inequalities, at least for those which are accidental, that's genetical or luck, and are not the result of those individuals' reckless, willful, immoral or unethical behaviour, though even in that case it might be arguable that there is an ethical duty to look behind the individual's actions to find if there are also external drivers. In the realpolitik world most politicians inhabit, by choice or per force, ethical cases are usually not enough on their own. Well, a second argument for intervention is social, and this can take several forms. A small c conservative values order. A society in which there are large inequalities is likely to become disorderly, or at least less orderly. In that event, it would make small c conservative sense to reduce those inequalities to the point where they do not threaten disorder. And it might be argued that New Zealand society became less orderly with the widening income and wealth inequalities after the economy was deregulated in the 1980s and 1990s. To the small c conservative, order without common purpose is not order, and that is why small c conservatives are wary of neoliberalism and libertarianism. A liberal conservative values social and economic mobility. Material inequality is acceptable, including to those who are less well off, if there is high mobility. That is, either the less well off individuals can improve their condition, or their children can do better than they do. This was arguably the secret of the United States' success through much of the 20th century. Nancy Birdsell, whom I began reading 10 years ago, has argued, though some now dispute her analysis, that mobility through education is an important part of the secret of the rise of the East Asian tiger economies in the 1960s to 80s, to which you might now add China in the 1990s and 2000s. It is a reason why after the Second World War here, many on the national side of politics bought into social security, the expansion of education, and near free health services. The social or left liberals value equality of opportunity, which they see as critical to genuine individual freedom. They argue that intervention is required not just on ethical or social order grounds, but to ensure the disadvantaged are able to take advantage of opportunities, that they are genuinely free to make a good life, that there are not removable obstacles in the way. In this way of thinking, just making education available is not enough if a poor start has rendered a child ineducable. The same goes for ensuring good health, including good housing, and ensuring a livable basic income for parents. And that leads directly to a third and harder argument for intervention, that there is an economic benefit. Intervention very early in life to ensure a child is developing emotionally, socially, and cognitively fits the child for education and delivers a work-ready, productive, tax-paying individual in the late teens or early 20s. As the nature of work has changed and continues to change, a greater capacity to become skilled and adapt to changing skill is needed to avoid being condemned to low-income, in-person service jobs or unemployment. And this is no longer a matter of intellectual inquiry. It is a pressing practicality. Business is starting to take an interest, as Phil O'Reilly's backing of Every Child Counts and membership of the Children's Commission as Expert Advisory Group indicates. Well, export as well. One way to think about this is to follow the train of thought, as Philippa has indicated, in the spirit level, that there is a strong coincidence between material inequality and economic performance. But the spirit level authors are epidemiologists, their own self-description, and have not demonstrated, or at least not adequately demonstrated, a causal link. Their book distills coincidences, not causes. The risk is that it may underweight the degree to which a loop is operating rather than an arrow, and the spirit level has been criticised from both left and right. Well, one route to a harder argument is by way of examining the economic role of ecosystems and the physical environment. The usual debate is over the right balance between conserving the physical environment and economic development, and this is the position the John Key government takes. It poses a question of the environment or the economy, and much more often than not comes down for the economy. More logically, in this supposedly 100% pure and clean green place is to think in terms of the environment and the economy. Increasingly, some in business are starting to think that way, as the Pure Advantage group of chief executives demonstrates. And that leads logically to thinking of the physical environment and its constituent ecosystems as infrastructure, in particular as economic infrastructure. And I'm indebted to Paul Reynolds, the Chief Executive, Ministry for the Environment, for this thinking. As is the case with roads or water or waste systems, for example, failure to invest in and maintain infrastructure has an economic cost, and investment in infrastructure a corresponding economic benefit. So, logically, invest in and maintain ecosystems. That doesn't tell you what investments to make. It is a way of thinking, a mentality, not a program of action. But if you change the way you think, you pose different questions and come up with different answers, and they are more likely to be innovative answers. Ecosystems and the physical environment can be thought of in the biblical terms of Genesis 1:26, which gave humans dominion over all living things, and we might add minerals and fuels, implying a license to exploit. In that light, the environment or the economy makes logical sense and points us mostly to choose the economy. An alternative is to think of ecosystems as our indispensable sustenance, the infrastructure underlying and underpinning the superstructure of our material well-being, without which we and our descendants cannot live well, and maybe in some future time cannot live at all. That would lead us to think of the environment and the economy, and the questions we pose and decisions we make are likely to be different, ones directed to investment and maintenance. Well, might not this logic be applied to negative inequalities which undermine common purpose? Might a cohesive, well-functioning society, one of unique individuals bound in common purpose, also be infrastructure underlying and underpinning the superstructure of our material well-being? Well, one way of thinking about negative inequalities is to shrug them off with the poor will always be with us, they make poor life choices, or if the rich do well, all boats will rise and the goodies will trickle down. And that would be to pose the issue as cohesion or the economy. In that frame, we are likely to choose the economy more often than not, and regard inequalities as a given, an exogenous factor, to be treated with palliatives, benefits, income support, subsidised houses, child welfare interventions, and so on. All necessary, but not sufficient if we want the most for the economy from the most people. An alternative might be to think of in terms of cohesion and the economy. And that suggests a program of action which seeks to reduce negative inequalities, understanding that equalities evolve, wax and wane, take different forms, and have different intensities over time within and between individuals. That is, it suggests a program of action to enhance mobility across education, skill, income, health, lifestyle, and aspiration bands, both of individuals within their lifetimes to maximise their potential and across generations. That way, individuals might more readily align with a common purpose and contribute to it. Social cohesion would strengthen, and the economy would be more soundly based because social disorder, which is bad for the economy, would be less likely. The questions we pose and the decisions we make are more likely to be directed to investment and maintenance. This different way of thinking is likely to focus on enabling measures. take it or leave it options do not reach those who, for some intrinsic or extrinsic reason, do not have the capacity to take it. For those people, there must be active encouragement and enabling. And I had a list which I've removed in the interest of time. The linking theme is investment. The implication is that from the investment will come a return, a dividend. The John Key government has in fact moved partway down that route, and there is some indication future governments will follow. The next step is to focus the investment beyond specific short-term results and on long-term social cohesion as building and maintaining social and economic infrastructure. That requires big minds, big hearts, and big pockets. How possible is that in a hyper-globalised world? Are not nation-states now limited fiscally and even in their capacity to legislate and regulate? Isn't that, and the new production and distribution systems that come with it, the real reason for the growth in income and wealth inequality? Well, hyper-globalisation and its fellow travellers haven't stopped road building yet. So maybe there is scope for some innovative policy and action. A small country can do that much more readily than a big one, if it wants to.